Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church.
Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 38. Are there any connections between the story in Genesis 38 and previous incidents in the Genesis narrative?
Yeah, I think that there are, and one of them that we can certainly take note of is Judah is unaware of Tamar's identity because she's covered with a veil. And I think we can't help but think back to one generation prior when Jacob is with Laban and he thinks he's marrying Rachel, but instead on the wedding night, he is deceived into marrying Leah, and he doesn't discover the switch has occurred until the morning, which suggests, of course, that in the wedding veil that he hasn't discovered the true identity of Leah and realized that he's been duped by Laban. And so we have in this kind of close proximity in the Genesis narrative, these two examples of these men who are both fooled as to the identity of who it is that they are sleeping with as a result of this veil that's hidden. There also is perhaps an echo we could make back to the unfortunate episode with Lot and his daughters. In that case, it wasn't a physical veil that had been imposed, but instead it was the veil of the eyes of drunkenness. So there are these kind of repeated themes or episodes in Genesis, we might say, of mistaken identity revolving around these interactions between men and women that seem to be kind of revealing this ongoing issue of treachery and deception in the narrative. And in all three of those instances, someone is being duped, and it's the man regarding the identity of who it is that he is interacting with.
What should we make of this man, Hira, the Adullamite, who is friends with Judah and shows up throughout this story?
Yeah, if you're really reading back through chapter 38, I think you're going to be struck by how many times this guy Hira shows up. We first meet him when Judah sort of leaves his family and goes among the Canaanites. We read that he makes friends with a certain Adullamite. That's this man Hira. And then when he's going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, and he stops to sleep with Tamar, who he doesn't recognize as his daughter-in-law and thinks is a cult prostitute. We read that Hira was with him going up there. So that's sort of a shocking thing in of itself, that he's in this company of this good friend, and he doesn't think anything of stopping to sleep with a prostitute while he's on this journey with his buddy. And then when Judah goes to repay this prostitute and to recover his personal possessions that he's left with her, he sends Hira to go do this for him. And so I think a few things are interesting. Number one, that Judah is regularly in such company with this man. Secondly, Judah has no compulsion about his moral behavior while in the company of someone else. It's not as though he's doing these things in privacy. He's aware, at least, that somebody else knows what's going on, which I think underscores for us that Judah is currently hanging out with people and in deep friendship with individuals who are, let's say, not iron sharpening iron kind of relationships. These are not godly people that Judah is hanging out with. He's making good friends with the Canaanites. He's traveling around in their company, and he seems to be arranging his life to suit the Canaanite way of living. And part of that is fraternizing through these kind of evil deeds and with almost no shame. And so I think Hira, his regular inclusion throughout this narrative, is yet another mark of the way in which Judah is being Canaanized and is hanging out among other people who are, morally speaking, fools, people who are apart from God and are just as wicked in their character as Judah himself is.
How do we address Tamar's actions? Do the ends justify the means?
No, I don't think so. I think we need to recognize a couple of different things that are, I think, fascinating about the depiction of Tamar throughout not only the Bible, but particularly here in Genesis. It is interesting that Moses doesn't give us any kind of editorial comment about Tamar's behavior. In other words, he neither commends it nor does he condemn it. And we might be expecting a more overt condemnation for what she does. There seems to be almost some kind of implicit, I'll stop short of saying endorsement, because Moses doesn't commend what she does, but Judah says that this woman has been more righteous than I have been. And So it's interesting that we don't have something to kind of offset Judah's remark, an editorial comment by Moses saying, well, what Tamar did was wrong. Perhaps he just understands his readers, informed as they will be by the law that clearly expresses sexual prohibitions of this kind of behavior, that they will already have a conscience that's well informed that this is wrong behavior, not only from the formal law, but also from natural law as well. However, I do think we need to recognize that Tamar, while she is behaving sinfully, there is, I believe, an impulse to the good of what she's ultimately trying to accomplish. But who does she have who is teaching her the ways of the righteous or the ways of God? The only connection that she would seem to have to actual people who have had contact with the covenant God of heaven and earth is through Judah, her father-in-law, who we've seen is a wicked man who has raised, to this point in his life, wicked sons, who has disconnected himself from the family promise. So she seems to be trying to do the right thing, but then reverting to kind of Canaanite means, if we want to think of it that way, dressing up like a cult prostitute and deceiving her father-in-law. So it's both, I think, a pessimism about her father-in-law's character, that she thinks this is the only way that he will do what ought to be done, which is to find some way of preserving his family line. And then also, I think, her appealing to what she knows, which is, again, a Canaanite way of trying to solve problems. So while her means, I think we can look at as objectively sinful, I think we can also see in the text that what she was trying to accomplish was a truly good and righteous objective, even if she pursued it sinfully.
In your sermon, you mentioned that Tamar is one of only 4 women named in the genealogy of Jesus. Who are the other 3 women, and is there anything that links the 4 of them together?
So the other women named in the genealogy, aside from Mary, are, in addition to Tamar, are Rahab, Ruth, and then also the mother of Solomon, although Bathsheba is not actually named, she's referred to as the wife of Uriah in the genealogy, so she's at least mentioned in the genealogy. What's interesting about this group of women is if you consider Tamar and Ruth, we already compared their stories in the sermon, but then you consider Rahab. Rahab, of course, is by occupation a prostitute of the Canaanite peoples. So we see the connection there with what Tamar pretends to be. She's a Canaanite woman pretending to be a cult prostitute, and Rahab actually is a prostitute. And then we think of Bathsheba, and we think of somebody who was ill-used sexually and whose husband dies. And we see in that some interesting connections too with Tamar. So these women who appear in the genealogy of Christ are women who seem to have remarkable faith, even though at times there are things in their life story that God has clearly called them out of sin, that nonetheless we have these women, a couple of them are even Canaanite women, who are named by God in this genealogy of Jesus Christ as a way of honoring them and preserving the significant role that they played in the coming of the Jewish Messiah, who has become the Savior of the world and the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promises that there will come a seed through whom all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. I think it points to the significance throughout the biblical story of the role of women, and particularly of women like these, women of faith. Many of these women who came from really disadvantaged kind of backgrounds. They were Canaanite people apart from the revelation of God's promises. These were women in many cases who were not treated well in their lives. One thinks of clearly what's happened with Tamar. We see also, of course, we think of Bathsheba, and we wonder, even how much of a choice does she really have when King David comes and takes her and then has her husband, killed. We see with these women, again, just a testament to the fact that God uses people from the most unlikeliest of circumstances and backgrounds. He can redeem our past, and he delights in using people who, by faith, lean into and trust and believe in the promises of God. And I think it's a beautiful testament of all of those things, that these women are called out and named in an unlikely way in a Hebrew genealogy that seldom would feature women, but they're named in the most important genealogy of all, which is the genealogy of God the Son, Jesus Christ.
In your sermon, you noted that you believe Tamar's motive for bearing a child was to preserve the line of Judah. It could seem likely that her motive was not to be alone in her old age. What would make us learn more about her caring about the line of Judah after being treated so horribly?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? Because I posited that her motive is at least righteous, even if her means are less than righteous. And the question is, well, how do we know what her motive really is if the text doesn't explicitly tell us? And I think that there are, of course, multiple ways that you could choose to interpret Tamar's actions. You could view it as, well, maybe she just, as the source suggested, wanted a child for her old age so that she wouldn't be alone, or maybe she was trying to attach herself to an heir with Judah so that his property would become hers at some point, so she wanted access to his wealth. Or perhaps it was just spite, that she wanted to get back at Judah for the fact that he hadn't done what he promised, which was to give her his son Shelah. But I think in reality, the evidence of the text points strongly in one direction, and that is that Tamar is trying to preserve this family of Judah, seemingly to preserve part of the line of promise of Abraham's family. And I think that there's a few reasons to believe this. Number one, Judah's testimony himself, when he sees what Tamar has done, is to say, she is more righteous than I am. And Moses doesn't contradict Judah's statement. He seems to present Judah as, in this moment, having a realistic assessment both of his own actions as being profoundly unrighteous to this point, and as Tamar's, even if the act itself was not righteous, the motivation behind it clearly was. And so if we then apply that to what Tamar's motives must be, it can't be for any of these other reasons. It has to be something about preserving Judah's family line. Moreover, we see in Tamar this patient endurance of these really difficult and trying circumstances of being married to two very wicked men, the sons of Judah, who both die without leaving her a child, and then she's willing to wait in her widowhood. And for Judah's son Shelah, she doesn't go and marry outside of the family. She does what Judah has asked. And then when it becomes apparent that Judah is not going to do what he said, she doesn't go on and just marry someone else. She wants to raise up a child for this particular family line, even though, given Judah's character and what Judah is preparing to do, which is have her burned alive, it would seem that this is about the most precarious position that she could possibly place herself in. Because who's to say, when Judah finds out that Tamar has deceived him in this way, that he's not going to say, you really deserve to be burned now. So there's no motive in the text that would seem to explain Tamar's action, other than that she's trying to preserve the family line, and particularly the line of promise. And I think that reading is further justified by the fact that Matthew includes her by name in his genealogy. Of course, there are many, many, many women involved in the genealogy of Christ. Every single generation, of course, there are women involved. So for every man in the text who is named in that genealogy, one could supply the name of a woman, but only 4 of them are named. So I think in that we can see that she has a greater spiritual significance, and her actions are being honored by God, or at least her faith is being honored by God, as a result of the fact that her motive is further reaching than just trying to either spite Judah or take some of his possessions or have a companion for her old age. I think her hope is in a longer term perspective, a hope in the promises and what the family of Jacob through his son Judah could mean in the fulfillment of God's promises.
Based on the rules of the Levirate, wouldn't Obed have been considered the son of Mahlon and therefore not in the line of Judah?
Yep, so this is a question that refers to the connection we made to the book of Ruth, and how Boaz takes Ruth and marries her and then has a child. But interestingly, whereas in the Levirate rules, the son or the brother who marries his dead brother's widow, the son that would be produced from that Levirate marriage would be considered legally the son of the dead brother. But in the genealogy of Obed, he's named as the son of Boaz. So why is Boaz credited legally as the father instead of Ruth's former husband who had already passed away? And I think the answer to that is that in Ruth we have a kind of marriage that very closely resembles levirate marriage because it's the act of a kinsman redeemer supplying what was lost, which was a dead husband, in order to provide for the widow. But it falls short of the full form of levirate marriage, because levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25 was particularly for brothers marrying a sister-in-law, a dead brother's wife. Levirate marriage actually means the marriage of a sister-in-law, or a brother-in-law to a brother-in-law. So this principle that was to be exercised in Israel in order to preserve a whole house is in many ways mirrored in the Ruth account, as Boaz acts as a kinsman redeemer, but he's not actually a brother to Ruth's dead husband. And so as a result, he's able to be a kinsman redeemer to her, but the son in their family still remains legally Boaz's because he's not a blood brother to her former husband. Another hint at that is the fact that there's actually a nearer kinsman in the story of Ruth than Boaz is. But when he's put to the question of will he be the kinsman redeemer or not, and he decides not to do it, he's not brought before the elders of the city, and Ruth doesn't take off his shoe and spit in his face. It would be the custom if this man had refused to do what needed to be done according to the rule of levirate marriage. Well, the question is, why doesn't that occur? Because again, while what's being done in the book of Ruth is something very closely approximating levirate marriage through the act of a kinsman redeemer, because a brother is not involved, it falls one rung lower than being a full levirate marriage, and thus the legal provisions and the honor and shaming provisions are not in place for what happens in the book of Ruth. So there's a kind of a mirror image there, but with a key feature distinction, which is the non-existence of a brother in Ruth's case versus the passing on from one brother to another in the case of Tamar.
As we work through Genesis, it seems like there's great effort to wipe out the line of Abraham. We know that Satan's goal is to prevent the Messiah from coming. Can we draw any conclusions about the spiritual warfare going on specifically in this family?
I think we absolutely can, and I think Moses gives us that cue from the early going of the book of Genesis when he records the words that God spoke to the serpent all the way back in Genesis 3:15, which, as we've talked about numerous times, is in many ways not only the first proclamation of the gospel in the biblical text, or the forerunning of the gospel, but it is also a kind of key thesis statement almost for the development of the rest of the book of Genesis, and that is that God says, I'll put enmity between you, speaking to the serpent, and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And so the rest of the book of Genesis is developing this seed of the woman that is going to become first many offspring, but is going to culminate in one singular seed, the he who is going to bruise the head of the serpent. So in the development of that seed line that is developing, we're calling it the line of promise that is going to culminate in Jesus, there's also this promise that there's going to be ongoing enmity, not only between this family of promise, but between the family of promise and the seed of the serpent. And the question is, who's the seed of the serpent? Well, the seed of the serpent are those who typify, or in their lives are the kinds of people who reject God, reject God's promises, and particularly reject this family line of promise. And we see this from the very early going of the Genesis narrative. So the very next chapter, Genesis chapter 4, we have Cain who kills his brother. Well, what does Cain look like? He looks like the seed of the serpent who is trying to extinguish the seed of the woman by killing his brother Abel. Well, we read in the New Testament, Jesus speaks to the religious leaders and he tells them, you are of your father the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning. Well, the question is, who is the first murderer? And that's Cain. And so Cain, Jesus says, is like the devil, who was a murderer from the first. And the religious leaders of Jesus' time, who end up putting the seed of the woman to death, Jesus Christ, they are like their father, the devil. So this ongoing spiritual warfare is this cosmic conflict between the seed of the woman that culminates in Christ and the seed of the serpent. In the book of Genesis, this is realized in the animosity toward the family of promise and the constant threat to the development of this seed. And that's not only, by the way, with other people, the Canaanites or others. Esau, for example, would be another one, even people in the family. Ishmael would be another threat to the promise. But there's even the consequences of the fall are a constant threat to the promise. Isn't it interesting that in Genesis 3, one of the aspects of the curse is that there will now be pain in childbearing? Well, we come to the family line of promise, and what do you know? Every single matriarch that we've encountered to this point has struggled with barrenness. They're all barren. And the question is, how on earth are all of these patriarchs so unfortunate as to just happen to continually marry barren women? How is that even possible? And it's the outworking of the curse that is being wielded against the seed of promise. And yet God continues to providentially, miraculously overcome even the curse itself by opening these dead and barren wombs in order that life, and not only life for the family of promise, but ultimately life for the world, can come from the one who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so the great story of redemption begins in this cosmic conflict over the line of promise that we see in Genesis all throughout from beginning to end.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.